Welcome to Chapter 18, Section 3 and 4. We're going to combine together and call it America as a World Power. It'll be the final video cast for this chapter. The big ideas are 1. How did the U.S. dictate imperialism in China? 2. Did all Americans view imperialism favorably? 3. How did the Roosevelt Corollary change the shape and direction of Latin America? And 4. How did missionary diplomacy affect the U.S.'s interactions in Mexico? Here's a great map out of the textbook here, which shows some of the U.S. Imperialistic activities from 1867 to 1906. We've already talked about Pearl Harbor here, where Hawaii gives the U.S. exclusive rights to the harbor as a naval base. We talked about the Alaskan area here, how we bought that from Russia. This led to some conflicts in the Bering Sea here. There's some other instances of imperialism. What we're going to focus on now is the open door policy in China. The open door policy was specific to China because the U.S. saw the Philippines kind of as their gateway into Asia. If you look back at the previous slide, you'll see that America started from west from the Hawaiians. They moved to the Midday Islands, the Wake Islands, Guam, Philippines, and then they end up in China. And at this time, China was referred to as the sick man of Asia because countries like France, Germany, Britain, Japan, and Russia had all established prosperous settlements along the coast of China, but they had never colonized a large portion of the colony. Because these countries had already established trading bases along the coast, the United States started to fear that China would be carved into colonies, similarly to Africa and the scramble for Africa. So U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issued a series of open door notes, as they're called, and these notes were letters addressed to imperialist nations proposing that the nations share the trading rights of China. So instead of one nation imperializing one portion, making one portion of China their colony, and a different country making another portion of the country their colony, they would all work together and the entire country would be open. This was issued in 1899 to the main imperialist powers, and they reluctantly agreed to this. This political cartoon here, I think, does a great job of showing you the various examples of open door policy. See here literally the open door to China right here, and you see Uncle Sam here holding a key that says American diplomacy, which is the key to the door. And then you have the various leaders here, from the Russian leader to the English leader to the German leader to the Italian leader, the French leader, all are here looking at the American as he is opening the door. This American policy was instituted, like I said, by John Hay, and all of the countries reluctantly agreed to it. This is a large and important key idea here, is because this is different than any other country at the time. The open door policy is the idea that no single industrialized nation would have control over China, rather they would share trading routes. And this is really the only place where it happens. And it becomes vital in China because they have tons of resources, both natural, and they have a huge labor market to trade with and to employ as well. So this is a huge resource for all the countries. So naturally, this was not something that all of Chinese men agreed with. There was a number of secret groups within China, the most famous being the Boxer Group, and they really disputed and disliked this Western or foreign influence in their country. So they began killing foreigners, missionaries, Chinese converts to Christianity because it was a Western religion within the country. This unsettled the Europeans because they were really jeopardizing their settlements there. So a collective group of British, French, German, Japanese, and American soldiers marched to the Chinese capital of Beijing, where they put down the Boxer Rebellion in August of 1900. And this really squashed the revolution that could have happened, or the revolutionary feelings. Now, just because in this part of American history here, America is doing very well internationally and gaining a foot on the world stage, doesn't mean everyone agreed. And the most iconic example, or the best known, is the Anti-Imperialist League, which is a group of people, a league that was formed, and it was formally against the idea of imperialism. The only issue they really dealt with was imperialism. And there was some famous people within the group that advocated for this. You have Jane Addams here, and if you remember, Jane Addams was the founder of the Hull House in Chicago, so helping to create houses for women and children who don't have any resources. You have Andrew Carnegie here, who also didn't believe in imperialism, and you also have Mark Twain. All famous people in American societies at this time who spoke out against the idea of imperialism. And what I want you to get out of this key idea here is, one, that not everyone agreed with these imperialist sentiments that the national government was having at this time. And there was some famous people as well that advocated against anti-imperialist thought. You have people, and these are all examples, mainly Mark Twain, who is a great influence at this time on American culture. He's writing his great works of art. He's starting to become known internationally, and he really has a voice, and he uses that voice against imperialism. At this time, because America is starting to enter the world stage, you have President Teddy Roosevelt right now, and he is actually brokering a deal between Russia and Japan here, who are currently ending their fight in the Russo-Japanese War here between the two countries. And while the United States had no input on the war, we didn't favor one side really, we didn't fight for one side, we didn't give them resources, because America is becoming a stronger country, we're entering the world stage here, we help as a nation, and Teddy Roosevelt does this kind of single-handedly, broker the peace deal between the two of them. It's called the Treaty of Portsmouth. It's because both countries got together, and these are the ambassadors that they sent to Portsmouth, where Teddy Roosevelt really brokered this peace deal to end the war. And as a result, he actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. So as the world is becoming quickly united, especially with the United States, entering as a world player, a lot felt that there needed to be a better way to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific, a canal of some kind. And the Panama Canal is what comes out of this desire, because it's a very thin part of Latin America here, so it's easy to build this canal to connect both oceans. And in doing so, you save the time, because you can go through from one ocean to the other here on the globe. You do not have to go all the way around South America. So this is saving a ton of precious time. Before the canal even happens, the United States is in agreements with both Britain and Japan, and through these agreements they end up having the rights to the canal. The problem is that this area of Panama right here was owned by Colombia. It was a territory of Colombia at the time. So in order for the United States to begin work on the canal, they would need permission from Colombia. These negotiations between the United States and Colombia did break down. And as a result, the United States helped the Panamanian rebellion against Colombia in order to get the canal that they wanted. So on November 3rd of 1903, nearly half a dozen U.S. warships were present at Panama as Panama declared its independence from Colombia. And 15 days later, after it gained independence, it gave the U.S. control of the canal for a portion of 99 years. So this is important here because, one, now that the U.S. is becoming a world player on the stage, they're using its newfound naval power. Remember that naval power we built up just a period within the last 20 years to be the third biggest in the world, and that's at the advice of Admiral Alfred Mahan. And we then send our warships to Panama, who uses this as a backdrop to declare their independence from Colombia, and then they give us the rights to the canal. So summarizing what happened, the U.S. agreed to buy this route here from France. This route meaning the Panama Canal route right here. Panama was a colony of Colombia. The U.S. helped organize the rebellion to establish the independent country of Colombia, and in doing so, we got the canal here, which we leased for a period of 99 years. And once we leased the canal, we started building the canal, which would connect both oceans. And it officially opened, on August 15th of 1914. Okay? Meaning that the 99-year lease would go to 2013. And even though we did compensate Colombia $25 million in 1921 for them losing this territory of Panama, it really did hurt our reputation in the area, excluding Panama, because they were grateful that they became independent. But it hurt us with the surrounding countries because they felt that we were going to start taking advantage of them. So before we get into the Roosevelt Corollary, it's important that we look back and review the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was issued by President Monroe's presidency and his administration, and it was the idea and kind of notice to the rest of the world that, hey, Europeans, you stay out of this area, and we're going to protect this Western Hemisphere. We're the big dogs in charge. We're going to take over and really protect it. This is our sphere of influence. And that really has stayed, and that reputation and that idea has continued all the way about 100 years later. And President Teddy Roosevelt reminded European countries of the doctrine that was issued in 1823. Because at this time, European countries were issued with had a series of issues, such as high debts from European banks to build railroads. They were still developing as industries. They were having a hard time keeping peace within their country. There's a lot of rebellions. So he thought, Teddy Roosevelt, that if he didn't reissue the Monroe Doctrine, his kind of 2.0 version, that the Europeans may start to come over and recolonize the area. So as a result, he issued the Roosevelt Corollary. And this just added to the Monroe Doctrine, saying that the U.S. would be in charge and protect its interest in Latin America. And this is the key idea here, again, that this is America's sphere of influence, the West, and we're going to take care of it and we're going to protect it. You can see here in the political image, you have Teddy Roosevelt here carrying his big stick, which we'll talk about in just a second, leading all of the American warships here around the Caribbean to these various different islands, trying to solve all the problems. He's the one kind of pulling all of these ships together that are the issues, if you will, to do what's necessary. And he had this philosophy called speak softly and carry a big stick, meaning you're not going to make a lot of problems. You're just going to say what you want to say. You're going to tell the world, similarly to what he said here with his corollary, but that you have a big stick to back up what you're saying. So the idea is, he's not going to make a lot of trouble. He's going to state the interests of the United States plainly, but if anyone comes to mess with the United States or mess with Latin America, he has the big stick, the big Navy, and the Marines that he is more than happy and willing to use to fight against the countries if necessary. Okay? Now, one way that he's able to protect his influence in the region is through this idea of dollar diplomacy here. It's the idea that the United States is going to send money to Latin American countries as a way of diplomacy to help them out. The best example is Nicaragua, who in 1911 couldn't pay its debts. And so the United States gained control of the Nicaraguan state-owned rail system and its national bank. Now, this caused a lot of issues within the country, and that's kind of out of the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But the main thing that you need to know about dollar diplomacy is that it was used to send money to countries in Latin America that needed it, the idea being to keep European banks out of Latin America, that it would be, again, America's sphere of influence, and that we would take care of them. The next guiding philosophy that comes is with President Wilson. And this is President Wilson here in the picture. And his idea is to use missionary diplomacy. And what missionary diplomacy is the idea that the U.S. has a moral responsibility to any Latin American government it views as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to the U.S. interests. So what would happen is that the United States would not recognize that government because they may be oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to the U.S. interest. And this does include the U.S. Economic interest as well. So it's important to know the difference between dollar diplomacy and missionary diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy we tend to associate with William Taft, who came after Roosevelt, and kind of both meant together because it developed off each other, but the idea that the United States sends money to bolster diplomacy. Missionary diplomacy was an idea of Wilson, and it was the idea that the United States wouldn't recognize these countries, so it wouldn't give aid when it needs it, lend a helping hand to these countries that it deemed oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile. The best example of missionary diplomacy happens to the south of our borders in Mexico. And while all of these leaders of the Mexican government are listed here, it's not important that you know them. I just listed them so you have a better representation of what's going on. In a nutshell, what's happening is you have Porfirio Diaz, who was ruling for over 3 decades oppressively in Mexico. He gets wiped out by the Francisco Madero forces, who are trying to make a democratic government. They get wiped out because they're unable to do so, and you get Victoriano Huerta, who comes in, and he's another dictator. This is where missionary diplomacy comes in, and Wilson fails to recognize him as the rightful president or ruler of Mexico at the time. Because if you remember the definition of missionary diplomacy, it's the idea that the United States doesn't recognize the Latin American government. Now, the reason Victoriano Huerta is so important is because he actually captured some Americans that were in his territory, and the government soon let them go, but Wilson used this as his gateway into the country and actually sent troops into Mexico at this time. So at this time, because the government has failed to recognize the Mexican government, they sent troops in. We're very close to war at this point. It's because Brazil and Argentina step in to mediate the problems, and as a result, Huerta steps down is one of the causes not to go to war. Then you have another ruler, Carranza, and he's ineffective, which leads to kind of the rise of Pancho Villa, the famous Mexican tale that you hear so much about. And what he did was really oppose Carranza's government because him and his partner Emiliano Zapata were really trying to advocate for land reform and to help the peasants out. They didn't get that, and they clashed with the government and go on the run. The important thing about Pancho Villa, though, is that Wilson sends in John J. Pershing to capture him with 15,000 troops. He's unable to do so, and the troops in him get recalled as the United States is entering World War I in 1917. And finally, the Mexican Civil War ends with Obregón, who brings civility and democracy back to Mexico. So while you don't need to know these men, Pancho Villa is kind of an important folk figure in American or in Mexican culture you may want to know. It is important to see this as an example of missionary diplomacy. So what did we learn? One, how did the U.S. dictate imperialism in America? Well, this is important as they dictated it through one important way, the open door policy. And this open door policy was developed by the American and then kind of agreed upon by all the Europeans, and so no one colonized China. They just had spheres of influence and kind of all used it at the same time. Was imperialism viewed favorably by all Americans? The answer is no. And remember, we talked about some great examples of people who don't believe it was a good idea, mainly Jane Addams, Andrew Carnegie, and Mark Twain. 3. How did the Roosevelt Corollary change the shape and direction of Latin America? This is the idea that, America is continuing to enforce the Monroe Doctrine almost 100 years after it was written. It's really getting a revival right now. And we are forcing the rest of the world to stay out of this area and really let it be. At the same time, we're intervening as a country when we want. And we did so in Panama to get the canal and have rights over it. And so we helped the rebels in Panama declare independence from Colombia. And then we were able to take control of the canal for 99 years, or lease it from them. And then 4, how did missionary diplomacy affect the U.S. interventions in Mexico? Well, remember, dollar diplomacy is the idea that you're giving aid, or specifically money, to these countries, whereas missionary diplomacy is the idea that you're giving them a seal of approval to the countries you agree with, or not giving the seal. And the U.S. did not give a seal to Mexico for a long time. And as a result, they continued to have high turnover within their government. Was the U.S.'s interactions the only result? No, but we helped kind of facilitate that civil war there and transition into a democratic government. So like I said, this brings us to the close of Chapter 18. We'll finish talking about these ideas in class before we move on to World War I. That's it for now. Until next time, Husky historians, we'll look at Chapter 19 and World War I.